Welcome to the Quiet Truth, where a lay Catholic finally notices that one of God's commandments is being slowly erased. I'm Tom Borak with episode 27, The Disappearing Third Commandment. A few weeks ago, the pious and learned Dr. Jennifer Borak told me that our local thrift store, run by the St. Vincent de Paul Society, was operating on Sundays. I was surprised, because I'd been a member of the Society for many years and always found my fellow Vincentians to be wonderfully Catholic role models for me and for my kids. I remembered that God told us not to engage in non-emergency servile work on the Lord's Day. Here's how the third commandment is set forth in the current Catholic Catechism, quoting from Deuteronomy. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work. In Catholic elementary school, I was taught that Catholics, other Christians, and Jews understood the Ten Commandments the same way, that they were and are the core of God's moral law, and that the first three commandments were the most important as they related to the first great commandment, love of God, while the last seven related to the second great commandment, love of neighbor. I remembered when the state laws prohibiting most businesses from operating on Sunday, the so-called blue laws, were repealed in New York and Pennsylvania. At that time, my parents told me that this repeal was anti-Christian and a shameful move to put the pursuit of profit and convenience ahead of God's commandment. That we were obliged not to seek or accept jobs that would require Sunday work. That if an employer directed us to work on Sunday, we should object on religious grounds. And that we were not to shop for non-emergency items on Sunday, and that even on weekdays, we should do our best to avoid stores that we knew were open on Sundays. They specifically discussed the hardest cases, the situations in which employees or business owners were being forced to choose between continuing to honor the Lord's Day as commanded, or maintaining their source of income. My parents told me that the most saintly thing to do would be to follow God's commandment, regardless of the circumstances, but that they had sympathy for people who could not easily find another job or another business, and that perhaps God would be forgiving of people in those circumstances. At the same time, they told me that going forward, Christians who had a choice of jobs or careers should certainly choose those which allowed them to fulfill their Christian duties. So I got comfortable with the idea that people of faith would not shop on Sundays, which would limit the incentive for Sunday selling, and that their children and grandchildren would choose jobs and careers that allowed for a godly lifestyle. By keeping their Sundays for the Lord, Catholics would bear witness that their faith could not be undermined by secularism, modernism, and consumerism. So I was surprised. I said to the good doctor, "Do you want me to complain?" And she said, "Yes, please," because that's the kind of relationship we have. So I called the central office of the St. Vincent de Paul Society in St. Louis and got in touch with a woman who seemed to have some significant responsibility for the thrift stores. I said, "I'd like to register a complaint regarding your thrift store in Limay." She said, "Oh, what is it?" I said, "It's open on Sunday." She said, "All of our stores are open on Sunday. What seems to be the problem?" I said, "The problem is that your stores are open on Sunday and you are a Catholic organization." She said, "Well, our board made the decision and they are all Catholic, and I believe that they consulted a priest." I said, "Well, how can I get my complaint to the board? May I address the board? May I have the members' email addresses?" She said, "Bring it up with your parish Vincentian conference, and if the members agree with you, then let the conference president raise it with the other conference presidents. And if they agree with you, then they can complain to the board." I said, "Fine, thank you." Since then, I wrote to the executive director of the St. Louis Vincentians. In return, I got a polite letter from his number two, acknowledging my concerns and setting forth a string of rationalizations for the board's decision. I contacted two priests, one who vigorously supported Vincentian Sunday sales, and one who would not express an opinion. I spoke to a handful of my fellow Vincentians. Most of them were uncomfortable with the Sunday sales decision, but did not have any interest in objecting to it. After all that, Here's the primary argument for refraining from unnecessary work on Sunday. The Supreme Being, who is far wiser than we, told us that in the Sabbath, you shall not do any work. Therefore, he's right, and if we disagree, we are wrong. And out of fear of him, if not out of respect and love for him, we should do what he said. Now, in case you worry that God made a mistake, or perhaps that Moses made some copying error, or that the commandment expired, or that it was never intended to apply to sophisticated moderns who wear pants and carry cell phones, allow me to explain how I've reasoned independently to the conclusion that the third is a commandment worthy of an all-knowing and all-loving God. First, the goal of the commandment is worthy of an all-loving God. Every human is in need of God's help to reach salvation, which is the ultimate good. Every human alive has a tendency to reject his help due to inherent human weakness, thoughtlessness, and sinfulness. We tend to forget God and to rationalize disobedience to his message and to the natural moral law. We can do this 100 times a day without any effort at all. Temptations, including those to which individuals are most vulnerable, surround us, and we drift toward them like bleary-eyed drunkards. To navigate these temptations and repeatedly choose to seek holiness, we need regular reminders, along with all the help we can get from our family and friends and members of our religious communities. The apparent goal of the third commandment is to provide us with such reminders that guide us toward God and that help our religious community support us in seeking salvation. Second, following the commandment is wonderfully effective for individuals and for communities, as would be expected from a commandment created by an all-knowing God. God's sensible schedule constantly focuses our attention on the Lord and his day. We are always aware of the day of the week and of how many days we have worked and how many more days until the work stops. If we've had any religious education at all, the week reminds us either of God's 6 days of creation followed by his day of rest, or of Holy Week culminating in Easter Sunday. Following this schedule for our work becomes a habit that reinforces any movement we are making toward God and that tends to interfere with any movement away from God. When the entire Christian community operates on this schedule, we reinforce each other's faith and remind each other of our duties to God. Third, following his commandment does not burden God's people, except in that it marks them as targets for the hatred and intolerance of people who reject God. It doesn't really impose any additional work or other burden on the faithful. Nearly everyone relies upon work to earn a living. And even in ancient times, when poverty was much worse than it is today, most people could get all of their work done in 6 days and benefit from a day of rest and contemplation. Christians who honored the Lord's Day were able to create the industrial and scientific revolutions in Europe. Today, it's even easier to limit our work days when the regular work week is usually limited to 40 hours. We generally have 2-day weekends, and we can shop 24 hours a day, 6 days a week via the internet or otherwise. Fourth, the commandment is timeless, as are the other commandments of God. Although the kind of work we do and the nature of our recreational activities have changed in a few thousand years, refraining from work on the Lord's Day can benefit us as it benefited the ancients. If it is harder to follow the commandments when living in the United States in the 21st century than it was in medieval Catholic Europe, that's not because of our society's fast pace or technological complexity. It is rather because we live in a society in which the majority of our neighbors are secularists who have repealed the blue laws and who have become comfortable with public sins that might have embarrassed the residents of Sodom and Gomorrah. They oppose Christianity, and especially Catholicism, either privately or very publicly. Facing this opposition, it is more important than ever that we, as an embattled religious minority, cling to our faith and order our lives according to God's law. We must show the world, and especially our children and grandchildren, that God is central to our lives, not a sideshow that can be ignored whenever real-world concerns arise. We must not even try to pass as lukewarm Christians or agnostics. So those are the two arguments, God's and mine. I may be wrong. God, not so much. But Tom, you silver-tongued but feeble-minded dinosaur, I hear you say, can't we prove that God's commandment doesn't matter by adding more and more exceptions and then gradually expanding those exceptions until there's nothing left of the commandment. To which I say, you can try. To find out how, join us again for episode 28, Rationalizing a Commandment to Death. Thank you for your kind attention.